Howdy, and welcome to Brandy's Book Stack. Today, we'll be talking about the books that I read in the months of July through September. So without further ado, let's jump into the stacks. I would like to talk briefly about the fact that I've been absent for a little while. I kind of needed to take a little bit of a break from my mental health. We had some illness in the family, and I had some personal illness, and then work was a bit crazy towards the end of September. But hopefully I'll be back on a more consistent posting schedule from now on. But into the books. First of all, I read the book Irresistible by Andy Stanley in July. This was a book from my church book club that I read, and it was about how the church has become very resistible to people, and how the church has driven people away, and kind of what the church can do to combat that. It was a lot about being less judgmental and being more open to people from different walks of life, and overall I felt like it had a very positive message. The only negative is I did think, like most books of this nature, it was somewhat repetitive and went over the same thing over and over and over again. So for that reason, I'd probably say about a 3.5 star, about the middle of the road for me. I didn't think it was anything too terribly groundbreaking, but it did have a good message that I think a lot of churches could stand to hear. So, moving on to Dragon's Blood. And I read, by the way, Irresistible on my Kindle, so that's why I don't have a copy. Dragon's Blood by Todd McCaffrey, was the next book that I read in July. And Todd McCaffrey is the son of the noted, depends on your perspective, fantasy or science fiction author. Anne McCaffrey herself argued that all of her works were science fiction. However, I disagree with that respectfully. Her books have a psychic link between humans and dragons in it, and while she says there's a scientific explanation for everything, I don't see how you have a scientific explanation for that. Also, her world is a medieval style world with lords and that sort of thing. It's very much a fantasy kind of world, so it has a lot of the hallmarks of it at any rate. But this is her son, and normally I'm not a huge fan of children taking on their parents' works, or siblings taking on siblings' works, or anything like that. But I love the world of Pern so much that Anne McCaffrey created that I really wanted to give this a shot. And this is a pretty decent book. It stays true to the themes and elements of McCaffrey's universe, but it still has a bit of its own flavor. I still like the books written by Anne McCaffrey better, so I'd certainly start there if you wanted to read something in the Pern universe. But this is a good novel. This novel takes place in two different time frames. There's one in the long far past, and then there's a time that's in the Pernese future, if you will. And there is a pandemic that is endangering the dragons, and there are two different women that are trying to prevent this, one in the past and one in the future. And there's a lot of good discussion regarding relationships and parents, and how we try to best parent our children while maintaining our responsibilities. There's just a lot of good character development in this book. So I do recommend it. Again, like I said, not quite as good as your normal Pern novels by Anne McCaffrey, but still worth a read. This is edging more towards the science fiction than McCaffrey typically did. Hers stayed more in what I would call a fantasy world, while this has much more of a scientific element to it. But a good read. I would say about 3.5 as well. You do rip through this one pretty quick, but a little better than middle of the road for sure. So definitely give that one a read. The The next book I read on my Kindle, and that's House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. I had never read anything by Edith Wharton before. I knew absolutely nothing about this novel going in, and that is one warning I want to give. I knew that Wharton wrote about the Gilded Age, and I do find that somewhat of a fascinating era. And what I was kind of expecting was a sort of glitz and glamour, fun novel. Now, really isn't what this book is, and that's not the fault of Edith Wharton by any stretch of the imagination. That's my fault, just not knowing anything going in. Mainly what threw me off was the title, which is The House of Mirth. That kind of sounds like we're going to have a fun book. We're going to be talking about uplifting things. But she actually got that from a verse in Ecclesiastes, which reads, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. And what that is meant to imply is that this novel is about the degradation of the main character, Lily Bart, as she sinks further and further into what at the time would have been considered moral depravity, what today we might call depression, desperation, mental illness, many other things. But definitely at the time it would have been considered moral degradation. And it is not a happy book. So if you're interested in reading Wharton, I still recommend it. It's very well written. It's a good book, but it is not a happy theme. It's a very not happy theme. So go into it maybe with your eyes a bit more wide open than I did, and it'll be a little less jarring, hopefully. Like I said, we follow our main character, Lily Bart, and she is struggling because she once was wealthy when she was a child. Her father lost all his money, and she became accustomed to living a wealthy lifestyle, and yet she always lacked love and caring. And because of that, she grew to value the wrong sorts of things. She valued monetary things and the wonders of the world, you might say. And she knows the only way she can get that back is through marriage to somebody who's wealthy. And yet the wealthy available men are a bit odious to her. So she struggles quite a bit with, should I go ahead and put my morals aside so I can live a life of luxury, or should I marry for love and be able to achieve happiness, but not have, the wealth and luxury I'm used to. And one of the things I really liked about the novel is that Lily Bart's character, she's very self-aware, in that she realizes that it's not going to be a walk in the park if she picks love. A lot of times in novels that they show this particular, choice, it seems like it's not really much of a choice. Of course, you're going to marry the poor person and you're going to be happy in your poorness, in your poverty. But in this book, it's not quite that simple. She knows she'll always remember that time when she had the luxuries of life. And as a woman in her particular time period, she didn't have the capability to get those things for herself other than through marriage. So, but unfortunately, like I said, this is not a book with a happy ending. And it goes pretty dramatically downhill. So just go into that eyes wide open. The next book, and I would say for House of Mirth, again, kind of in that 3.5 stars. And just as a reminder, when I do a rating, that's a rating on my enjoyment of the book, not necessarily the literary merit of the book or anything like that. I may give a book that's popular a very high star rating, and a classic that's beloved by many a lower rating simply because I didn't enjoy it as much. Those are just my feelings. You're free to disagree with them all day long. So the next book I read, and that would have been I read House of Mirth in August. I also read Season of Passion by Danielle Steele. I actually read this for my reading challenge, which was Non-Judgmental July. So why did I have judgmental feelings towards Danielle Steele? I guess when I was growing up, it seemed like the people who read Danielle Steele's books were people who, please understand my opinion has changed, but at the time, I kind of viewed people who'd read Danielle Steele as somewhat simple-minded. They were people that weren't intellectual and kind of vapid that read Danielle Steele's books. And that's how I felt when I was younger. Now that I'm older, and part of the reason I started the Non-Judgmental July challenge is because I realize as a much more mature adult that there's often things that we are judgmental about in our youth that as we grow older, we realize, if a lot of people are into them, there's usually some merit to them somewhere. That maybe we just couldn't see. And that was true in the case of Danielle Steele. I read this book, Season of Passion, and it was a pretty decent romance. The things I kind of expected of a Danielle Steele novel was that the prose was going to be awful, and that it was probably going to be spicy. And I'm not a big fan of spice. Not that there's anything wrong if you are. It's just not my particular taste. And I was very surprised, pleasantly. For one, this book is pretty low on the spice meter, and maybe this is just because this novel was written, I think it was in the 70s. Yes, 1979. So quite a while ago when it was a lot easier to shock our public. But there were really only 3 spicy scenes that I really remember from this novel. And by today's standards, they were not terribly spicy. And as far as the prose is concerned, okay, it's not Shakespeare, right? But it's a popular contemporary novel. That's not what it's supposed to be. And her plot does clickety-clack along. She doesn't spend a lot of time on exposition, and I think that's part of why she's so popular, is because most people enjoy plot-driven novels, and this is very plot-driven. It's just, action to action to action to action. What I did, there are some things I did not like in this novel. There is a very young woman who... like a teenage young woman who takes up with a much older man, a man in his 30s, who is a successful professional football player and has a lot of power. And yet this is portrayed as a kind of perfect relationship to some degree. And that really bothered me. But all in all, this had a lot to commend it. There was a female relationship, a friendship between the main character and another woman that I thought was really beautifully done. How these two women, especially the other woman that's not the main character, was very supportive and caring of the main character here, which I thought was really lovely. We don't see that often enough in fiction. And that was a really great thing. I also thought that it had a relationship between a mother and a child that was a bit more realistic than I typically see in romance novels. Like, a lot of times the child is kind of just window dressing and is shoved in the corner. And that still happened to some degree here, but less than I would have expected. And the main character does go through a lot of personal growth, really comes into her own and comes into believing in herself. The main character is a writer. So I thought that was good. There is a fairly realistic depiction of severe mental illness that's in this novel as well that I thought was well done. So a lot to commend it, like I said. And I have to take back any of the negative opinions I have for Danielle Steele. Again, I mean, this isn't going to be like one of my very favorites, I'd probably put it, again, this seems to be like a 3.5 sort of time frame for me, but I'd say about 3.5. It's a little better than middle of the road. But definitely, if I see a Danielle Steele book again in the future and I have a free moment, I wouldn't hesitate to pick it up because I found this to be very enjoyable. So, the next book that I read during this time frame was... I had the wrong one. Hold on. An Irish Country Doctor by Patrick Taylor. This was a new favorite for me. 5 out of 5 stars. If you like cozy fiction, and I like cozy fiction a lot, but with some caveats, it has to be not too terribly schmaltzy, not too ooey gooey, or I kind of get turned off. You know, it becomes too saccharine sweet. And this does a really great job of straddling that line. In this novel, we follow a young man, Barry Laverty, who is looking for an apprenticeship as a doctor. And he knows he wants to be involved in a practice in the Irish countryside. And this is Northern Ireland. And he comes across this practice where he's interviewing for a job. And the gentleman that runs the practice is extremely rough around the edges. The first time he meets him, he literally finds him kicking a patient out on his ear and cursing at him. And this Dr. O'Reilly is the other character. And of course, as time goes by, he comes to understand that Dr. O'Reilly knows a lot of things that weren't in the medical textbooks and has a lot to teach him about not just managing the medicine, but also managing relationships with the people. And you find out there's methods to all of his madness. And it's just so charming. The characters in it are so beautifully done. And even the characters that are rough around the edges always end up having a surprise element to them. And again, it's just beautiful. I've read several other books since in this series, and it even holds up in the sequels so far. So I'm super excited to have another author to read that's really enjoyable, because this is done well without too much schmaltz. The drama is provided by a lot of the medical cases, which of course is real life drama that's actually experienced. There's not a lot of Deus Ex Machina. There's a little bit, but not a lot of that Deus Ex Machina that you tend to see, hand of God, that, oh, all of a sudden a fairy waved their magic wand and all the troubles suddenly disappear. It's not like that. There's always a solid, real reason they make things better. So definitely check out An Irish Country Doctor. And then I read The Little White Horse by Elizabeth Goudge. This is I think it's considered a middle grade novel. It might be young adult. This was written quite some time ago, and I'll find 1946. So, and it is a work of fantasy. And I'd really been excited to read Elizabeth Goudge. Elizabeth Goudge it was one of the big influences on J.K. Rowling, for example, when she wrote the Harry Potter series, on a lot of other authors. I see a lot of booktubers that really think she's the bee's knees. And so I thought, I've got to get some of her books and give them a try. For the most part, this was a charming story. It was definitely very well written. The prose is very beautifully done. But it had some elements I found really disturbing. And one of the elements is that there is a very young girl, I believe she was only 12, that was encouraged to get married at 12 by an adult. And I get it. Times were slightly different in the 40s, but they weren't that different. My parents would have been about 12 in the 40s, and I guarantee you they weren't thinking of marriage at that time. So I just found that just really disturbing. And then the other thing that I disliked is there is this idea of generational guilt, that we are somehow responsible to right the wrongs our ancestors may have done. And to put that guilt onto, again, a very young child of about 12. Now, this is a happy story. It has a good positive outcome at the end. And there's lots of really lovely things that happen in this novel, but those two really, really marred it for me and made this about a 2-star. If those elements were removed, I would have maybe made this a 5-star. It had that much of an impact for me. So maybe you read this and give it a shot and think I'm crazy. But like I said, those two things I didn't feel like I could ignore in this particular novel. So that's The Little White Horse by Elizabeth Goudge. And I'm not giving up on Elizabeth Goudge just yet. I will probably give her another try in the future. I do have another one of her novels on my bookshelves, but just this one didn't do it for me. All right, moving into September, and part of the reason I read few books is I read Shogun by James Clavell. And as you can see, it is quite lengthy, coming in at 1,152 pages. This chonker, I have a lot of feelings about. There are a lot of great things about this book, and then there are a lot of terrible things. It's like the little girl who, when she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she was horrid. That's kind of how I feel about this novel. So I think first it's important to understand a little history about James Clavell. James Clavell was actually held as a prisoner of war by the Japanese in World War II. And my understanding about reading about him is that he was very traumatized by that experience. So much so, he carried a can of sardines in his pants pocket for the rest of his life and had to stop himself from looking through trash cans because his fear of food insecurity was so great. So I do think that his experiences colored this novel both in good ways and in bad ways. In good ways because I think he was able to sort of paint a word picture better than maybe others would have, but I think he also brought some of his prejudices into this novel. He also left his wife for a Japanese woman, which I'll talk about, my thoughts on that later, but yeah, so kind of an interesting background with the author. So I'll start with the bad and maybe end with the good so we can end on a positive note with this one. The negative that I saw was, number one, I feel like Clavell overly exoticized Japan, and particularly Japanese women, and particularly Japanese women from a sexual perspective. Throughout the novel, Japanese women are portrayed as, oh, so dainty, so small. And it just gave me the ick a little bit. And like, as an example, there's a scene with a courtesan where she goes through all of the marital aids she used, and he's, oh, so scandalized. And I just felt like this wasn't necessary to advance the plot or display the culture of Japan, and I'm not even sure it was all that terribly accurate. Like I said, just kind of gave me the ick. There was about a page and a half where he discusses, the main character doesn't, but there is a page and a half where the joy of the lack of pubic hair on a woman is discussed, and it's kind of out of nowhere. It's like the plot beforehand and the plot after had nothing to do with it. It was just sort of inserted in there, It felt extremely gratuitous, and it made me very uncomfortable. So I had kind of a problem with that. Also, there is an adulterous relationship in this novel, which I have a lot of heartburn with as a married woman. That doesn't bother a lot of people, and that's fine. And I also felt like the violence in this novel was extremely gratuitous. Granted, this takes place in 1400, so I understand that was a violent age. There was a lot of violence, but I felt even with that in mind, I felt like it was over the top. And there's one particular scene in the novel where if you aren't familiar with Shogun, the premise is a Dutch ship with a British navigator, or pilot as they call him, shipwrecks on Japan. And at this time, Japan did not have contact with much of the Western world, and treats the sailors that are shipwrecked pretty abominably. And we follow one of the characters there, and I'm trying to remember his name. It doesn't really matter. Blackthorn. For most of the book, they call him Anjin-san, which means pilot. Blackthorn, we follow mainly him, but at one point the crew is thrown into this pit where they were contemplated to be left to die, and it's just really graphic. There's a scene of torture that's really graphic, and I just felt like that was unnecessary and gratuitous, and there's just a lot of killing in this book that I didn't feel was necessary to advance the plot. Perhaps it is more historically accurate than I'm aware, but it certainly felt very gratuitous. So do with that what you will. Now on to the good parts. Clavell, like Danielle Steele, his plot clickety-clacks along. And it kind of has to sustain a book of this length, but it does that job well. It also has a really great, strong female character in Mariko, who is a Japanese woman who definitely knows what she wants, has a plan and a purpose, and is driven to get what she wants and to be who she wants to be. And her character is fantastic. It also shows a great amount of growth in Blackthorn's character, because as we go through the novel with him, he slowly becomes more and more accepting of Japanese culture, really to the point of preferring it to his own culture. But it takes him time, and it takes him patience learning the other culture before he gets there. And they show that in a very beautiful, well-done way, to where he finally gets to that point. Overall, and the politics and the military struggle is very well outlined here. If you love like politics and warfare and that kind of thing, you will probably really love this book. I don't mind that, but it's not my favorite thing. So overall, again, I think we're in about the 3.5 range. Better than average by a little bit, but some of the off-putting elements drove this down for me. So that's James Clavell's Shogun. All right, and the last book that I read in September is At Home in Mitford by Jan Karon. And this is another cozy novel. And we follow in this book a pastor who is kind of questioning not necessarily his faith, but sort of his worth to the faith, and can he be effective? He's very lonely, and I liked that particularly, that they show that pastors get lonely too. It's not just their parishioners that struggle with that. A lot of times the helpers struggle with the same issues that the helped do. And it's about his life in this small town in Mitford, and how his community and his friends And the new friends he makes kind of pulls him out of his loneliness and gives him more of a purpose. And it's beautifully done. It's a great cozy novel. I will say it leans a little more to the schmaltzy side than, say, The Irish Country Doctor does. And I could see this getting worse in that regard, maybe through the series. I'll have to see as I read more in the series, but it's definitely enough to make me want to pick up the next book. And yeah, that's At Home in Mitford. I think it's worthwhile to give a try to. It definitely is a good cozy novel if you're just wanting something to curl up with and feel happy. So that's what I read in the months of July through September. And the reason I haven't gone through October, November, December is I felt like it would just make the video too long. So I will be coming out with another video in short order that goes through my reading in October through December. Until then, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. Thanks. Bye.